Xin chào các bạn. Sau đây mình xin đọc cái bài The Day of the Dead. Nó là một bài trong cái phương pháp Effortless English và mình đọc sau nhé. Mình sẽ dịch và sau đấy mình sẽ phản xạ cùng với tiến sĩ AJ Ho, tức là ông sẽ hỏi và mình sẽ trả lời nhanh. Và ông cũng có trả lời và mình cũng học. Nói chung khi mà mình học thì mình sẽ xem các câu trả lời của ông ấy trước và mình học theo. Và sau đấy là mình sẽ đuổi theo ông ấy, tức là ông ấy hỏi và mình sẽ trả lời trước khi là ông ấy trả lời. Rồi mình đọc trước đã nhé. Day of the Dead. Cái này mình sẽ chuyển lúc mà viết thì ông sẽ viết là thì hiện tại, nhưng mà khi mình chuyển thì mình sẽ chuyển về thì quá khứ nhé. Rồi bắt đầu mình sẽ đọc nhé. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. What I found is quite interesting. The atmosphere was like a party. There were people everywhere. They sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. They cleaned the graves and ate fresh flowers. Flowers. I walked through. I walked through the cemetery and admire the beauty of all colorful flowers. Rồi bây giờ mình sẽ dịch này. Ngày của người chết. Tôi đến Guatemala vào cái ngày của những người chết vào mùng 1 tháng 11 và tôi rất là tò mò về cái ngày lễ này. Bởi vậy nên là tôi đã đến nghĩa trang để xem có chuyện gì xảy ra. Những cái gì mà tôi nhìn thấy thì nó khá là thú vị. Cái không khí nó giống như một bữa tiệc ấy. Mọi người thì ngồi khắp nơi và các gia đình thì ngồi xung quanh xung quanh cái ngôi mộ, xung quanh các ngôi mộ của tổ tiên đã chết của họ này. Rồi họ lau ngôi mộ và bỏ thêm hoa tươi vào. Tôi đi bộ xung quanh cái nghĩa trang và tôi ngắm nhìn, tôi say mê đấy, tôi ngắm nhìn các cái màu sắc rực rỡ của các loài hoa. Rồi bây giờ mình sẽ phản xạ nhé, phản xạ cùng với tiến sĩ AJ Ho nhé. Rồi câu
In Guatemala, on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
Ok, bắt đầu phản xạ nha.
Did I arrive in Guatemala?
Yes, I did.
Yes, I arrived in Guatemala. Where did I arrive?
I arrived in Guatemala.
Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead,
November 1st.
November 1st. Who arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead?
Me, AJ. I arrived in
Well, me,
Guatemala on the
AJ,
Day of the
right?
Dead.
I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Did I arrive in Guatemala on November 3rd?
No, I didn't.
No, I didn't arrive in Guatemala on
November
November 3rd.
3rd.
I arrived in Guatemala on November
1st.
1st. What day did I arrive in Guatemala?
November 1st.
November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. Where did I arrive on November 1st?
I arrived in Guatemala.
Well, Guatemala, right? I arrived in Guatemala on November 1st. I arrived in Guatemala on the Day of the Dead,
November 1st.
November 1st. I was curious about this holiday, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Was I angry about this holiday?
No, I were not. I were not angry.
No, I wasn't angry about this holiday. Was I sad about this holiday?
No, I wasn't sad.
No, I wasn't sad about this holiday. I was curious about this holiday. Who was curious about this holiday?
Me, AJ Ho.
Well, I was, AJ. I was curious about this holiday. What was I curious about?
The day of the dead.
The holiday, right? I was curious about the holiday. Which holiday was I curious about? Which holiday was I curious about? The Day of the Dead. I was curious about the Day of the Dead. Was I curious about the Day of the Dead? Or was I curious about Christmas?
I was curious about
Well, I was curious about the Day of the Dead, of course. I was curious about the Day of the Dead, so I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where did I go?
I went
To the cemetery. I went to the cemetery. Did I go to the cemetery or did I go to the airport? Easy. I went to the cemetery. Who went to the cemetery?
I went to the cemetery.
Well, me, right? AJ. Right? I went to the cemetery. Where did I go?
I went
to the cemetery. Right. I went to the cemetery. When did I go to the cemetery?
I went to cemetery November 1st.
November 1st, the Day of the Dead, right? I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead, November 1st. Why did I go to the cemetery?
I went to the cemetery to see what was
Well,
happening.
to see what was happening. I went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Who went to the cemetery to see what was happening?
I went to the cemetery
Not
to
me,
see what
AJ,
was happening.
went to the cemetery to see what was happening. Where was the cemetery?
The cemetery where?
In Guatemala. Right? The cemetery was in Guatemala. What is the Day of the Dead?
Holiday. The Day of the Dead.
A holiday. Right? The Day of the Dead is a holiday. When is the Day of the Dead?
The Day of the Dead is
November 1st. The Day of the Dead was and is November 1st.
The cemetery on the Day of the Dead to see what was happening.
So I went to the cemetery on the Day of the Dead to see what was happening. What I found was quite interesting.
What I found was quite interesting.
Was it boring?
No, it wasn't.
No, it wasn't boring. Was it interesting?
Yes, it was.
Yes, it was interesting. The cemetery was interesting. How did I feel about the cemetery?
I felt interesting.
I felt it was interesting. Or I thought it was interesting. Was it boring or was it interesting? It was interesting. Of course, it was interesting. What was interesting?
The Day of the Dead.
The cemetery. The cemetery was interesting.
The cemetery was interesting.
When was the cemetery interesting.
The Day of the Dead, November 1st.
It was interesting on the Day of the Dead,
It was
November
interesting
1st.
on the Day of the Dead, November 1st.
Okay, the atmosphere
This atmosphere in the
in the
cemetery
cemetery
was like a party.
was like a party.
Party.
Was the atmosphere very sad?
No, it wasn't. It wasn't.
No, the
it
atmosphere
wasn't
was
very
not sad. The
The
atmosphere was like a party.
Was,
The
was like
atmosphere
a party.
was very happy.
Was very happy.
Was the atmosphere sad or happy?
Happy. The atmosphere were happy.
The atmosphere was
Were
happy.
like a party.
The atmosphere was like a party. What was like a party?
The atmosphere in the cemetery.
The atmosphere in the cemetery
was like a party.
was like a party.
This
Where was the atmosphere
the cemetery.
like a party?
The cemetery was the
In the cemetery.
in,
Right?
in
The cemetery. The atmosphere was like a party in the cemetery. Was the atmosphere like a party
No,
at my house?
It wasn't like a party.
No, not at my house. The atmosphere was like a party
at the
in the cemetery.
The atmosphere was not.
The atmosphere
like a
was
party in
not
my
like a
house.
party in my house.
Yeah.
So the atmosphere was like a party. There were people everywhere.
There was people everywhere.
Families were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors.
Ancestors.
Where were the families sitting?
They were sitting around the graves
Ah,
of their
around
dead
the graves.
ancestors.
Right? They were sitting around the graves.
Around the graves.
Who was sitting around the graves?
Families.
The families.
The
Right?
families.
The families were
Families
sitting
were sitting
around the graves. Were they sitting around the
No,
trees?
They were not. They were not sitting
No,
around the
they
trees.
weren't sitting around the trees.
They were sitting
They
around
were
the
sitting
graves.
around the graves.
Graves.
So, where were they sitting?
They were sitting
Around the graves.
Around the graves.
Families were sitting around the
Families were
graves
sitting around the
of
graves
their
of
dead ancestors.
ancestors.
Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors?
Yes, they were. They were sitting around
Yes,
the graves.
they
of
were
their
sitting
dead
around the
ancestors.
graves of their dead ancestors.
Ancestors.
Were they sitting around the graves of their
No, they
friends?
were not. No, they were not sitting around the
No,
graves
not
of
really.
their friends.
They were sitting around the graves of their dead
ancestors.
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 Who was sitting around the graves?
Family.
That's right. Families were sitting around the graves.
graves.
Whose graves were they sitting around?
The families.
Whose graves were they sitting around?
The families.
Yes, their dead ancestors. Their ancestors. Their ancestors' graves. They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. Were they sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors
They were
or
sitting around
the graves
their dead
of
ancestors.
their
Ancestors.
friends? Ancestors, right? They were sitting around the graves of their dead ancestors. They cleaned the graves and added fresh flowers. Okay. Who cleaned the graves? That's right, the families.
That's the families.
What did they add?
They add fresh flowers.
They added fresh flowers.
Added fresh flowers.
On Adapted Mind Reading, stories are designed to build vocabulary and comprehension. There are hundreds of stories to choose from, and all difficult.
Mẹ ơi, con mời treo. Đưa lại cho bố, mẹ đang học bài.
Did they add food?
No, they didn't.
No, they didn't add food. Did they add money?
No, they didn't. They didn't.
No,
add
no,
money.
they didn't add money. They added
They
fresh
added
flowers. What did they clean?
They cleaned the graves.
They cleaned the graves. Whose graves did they clean?
They cleaned the graves.
Their ancestors, right?
Their
They
ancestor.
cleaned
They
their
cleaned
ancestors'
ancestors'
graves. Where did they add flowers?
The graves.
Where? Oh, they added flowers to
Add
the
flowers
graves.
to the graves.
That's right. They cleaned the graves and added fresh flowers. Very good. I walked through the cemetery and admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Where did I walk?
I walked through the cemetery.
Through the cemetery. I walked through the cemetery. Did I walk through the park?
No, I did not. I did not walk through
No,
the
I
park.
didn't walk through the park. I walked through the cemetery. Where did I walk?
I walked through the cemetery.
Through the cemetery. Who walked
Me,
through
AJ.
the
I
cemetery?
walked through the cemetery.
I did, AJ. I walked through the cemetery. Did I walk through the cemetery? Or did I walk through the park?
Through the cemetery.
I walked through the cemetery. That's right.
And
And I admired the beauty
colorful flowers.
of all the colorful flowers. Did I admire the beauty of the trees?
No, I did not.
No, I didn't admire the beauty of the trees. Did I admire the beauty
No, I
of
did not.
the children?
I did not admire the beauty of the
No,
children.
I didn't admire the beauty of the children. What did I admire?
I admired the beauty of all
The
the
flowers,
colorful
right? Yeah, I
flowers.
admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers. Who admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers?
Me, AJ. I admire the beauty
That's
of
right.
all the
AJ, me,
colorful flowers.
admired the beauty of all the colorful flowers.
Rồi, okay, thank you for watching. Bye bye.